The rain poured relentlessly, transforming the busy entrance of the luxurious Regency Hotel into a mosaic of wet tiles and scattered reflections. Guests, clad in tailored suits and shimmering evening gowns, rushed inside, clutching umbrellas and murmuring about the storm. The doorman, sharp in his navy blue uniform, stood tall beneath the canopy, nodding and greeting with robotic politeness. From the corner of his eye, he caught sight of a figure lingering near the hotel's grand steps. She stood hunched against the downpour, wrapped in a threadbare coat that looked as though it couldn't keep the cold out. Her hair, damp and tangled, clung to her pale face. In one hand, she held a small canvas bag that had clearly seen better days. Her gaze shifted between the revolving doors of the hotel and the street, uncertain, almost hesitant. "Hey, you can't stand there," barked the doorman, his voice sharp enough to cut through the patter of the rain. He stepped forward, his polished shoes splashing in a shallow puddle. "This isn't a shelter. Move along." The woman flinched at his tone, but didn't immediately step away. Instead, she looked at him with quiet eyes, her voice soft yet firm. "I'm waiting for someone." The doorman snorted, glancing at her disheveled appearance. "Sure you are," he scoffed, crossing his arms. "This isn't the place for people like you. Go wait somewhere else." He gestured toward the street dismissively. A young couple exiting a sleek black car paused for a moment, their expressions tightening as they overheard the exchange. The woman in the pair glanced sympathetically at the stranger, but the man pulled her along, muttering something under his breath. Others followed suit, some averting their eyes as if ignoring the situation would make it disappear, while a few threw disapproving glances in the doorman's direction. The homeless woman adjusted the strap of her bag and straightened her posture slightly. Despite her worn-out appearance, there was something composed about the way she stood, something dignified that seemed out of place with her circumstances. "I won't be long," she said quietly, but the doorman was having none of it. "Don't make me call security," he warned, his tone dripping with impatience. "This is a high-class establishment, lady. We don't need people like you scaring off our guests." As if on cue, another car pulled up, this one a sleek, white limousine. The driver jumped out and rushed to open the door. The doorman's demeanor instantly changed, his shoulders straightening, and his face breaking into a practiced smile. He stepped toward the arriving guest, leaving the woman standing on the wet pavement. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line as she watched him shift gears so easily. She backed away slightly, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of the rain had finally seeped into her soul. A passerby, an older man with a weathered face, paused beside her, his umbrella shielding her from the rain for a moment. "You all right?" he asked gently. She nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice sincere but tinged with a sadness that lingered even after the man nodded and moved on. The doorman returned a moment later, his fake smile replaced by the same cold disdain as before. "You're still here? Seriously, what's it going to take to get rid of you?" The homeless woman looked at him, her gaze steady despite the trembling in her hands. "It's not what you think," she said softly, but the doorman waved her off, already pulling out his phone. "I'll let security deal with you," he muttered, his voice laced with annoyance. Before he could make the call, a voice from inside the hotel interrupted. It was rich and commanding, yet calm. "What's going on out here?" The doorman froze, his eyes widening as he turned toward the source. Standing just inside the revolving doors was a tall, elegant woman, her tailored coat draped perfectly over her shoulders. The guests inside whispered among themselves, some even sneaking photos. It was Nicole Kidman. Wordlessly, she stepped outside, the rain seeming to hesitate around her presence. Her gaze landed on the homeless woman, and in an instant her expression softened. The doorman's irritation grew as the homeless woman lingered near the hotel entrance. Her presence was like a stain on the otherwise pristine image of the establishment. The storm had intensified, but she didn't seem to care. She stood quietly, her head slightly bowed, a picture of patience and endurance. Guests passed her by with a mix of indifference and discomfort, some whispering, others ignoring her entirely. "You're still here? Unbelievable," the doorman muttered under his breath, shaking his head. He stepped closer, his voice rising. "What part of 'move along' don't you understand? Are you deaf or just stubborn?" The woman's eyes lifted to meet his, calm but resolute. "I told you. I'm waiting for someone." "Someone," he scoffed, his laugh dripping with mockery. "Who on earth would be meeting you here? A food bank charity? Give me a break." A group of guests huddled under umbrellas stopped to watch the scene unfold. Among them was a middle-aged woman in a chic trench coat, who frowned at the doorman's behavior. She whispered to her companion, "That's a bit much, don't you think?" Her companion shrugged, clearly eager to get inside and away from the spectacle. The homeless woman remained still, her quiet dignity only serving to irritate the doorman further. He took a step closer, his voice lowering but gaining an edge. "Look, you're making people uncomfortable, all right? Just take whatever story you've cooked up and go. I'm sure there's a shelter around the corner." Her face didn't flinch, but her voice trembled slightly as she replied, "I have as much right to be here as anyone else." That was the final straw for him. "A right? Lady, this isn't the corner store. This is the Regency. People like you don't belong here." He gestured broadly to the glimmering lights and polished marble of the entrance, as though the grandeur itself proved his point. Nearby, a hotel staff member, a young bellhop, shifted uncomfortably. He glanced at the woman, then at the doorman, as if torn about whether to intervene. He opened his mouth to speak, but quickly shut it when the doorman shot him a look. Meanwhile, a few bystanders began murmuring. A man with a smartphone whispered to his partner, "Why is he so pressed about her? She's not even doing anything." "She looks familiar," another person said softly, squinting through the rain. The doorman didn't notice the growing discomfort among the crowd. He was too focused on making his point. "You need to leave. Now. Before I call someone to remove you." The homeless woman's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag, her shoulders squaring ever so slightly. "You don't know who I am," she said quietly, her voice steady. The doorman rolled his eyes dramatically. "Oh, please. Let me guess. You're a princess in disguise? Or maybe you're an undercover billionaire who just forgot her wallet." He smirked, clearly enjoying his own sarcasm. "Save the fairy tales for someone else." From the corner of the lobby, the murmurs grew louder. A concierge, standing by the front desk, leaned over to whisper to a colleague. "I think I've seen her somewhere before," he said, his tone uncertain but intrigued. The woman outside didn't react to the doorman's jeering, but her calm demeanor only seemed to fuel his disdain. "You think you can just stand here and people will feel sorry for you? Newsflash, lady, the world doesn't work that way. Get out before I make you." Suddenly, a flash of recognition crossed the face of a woman in the crowd. Her eyes widened as she grabbed her friend's arm. "Oh my God, that's," she began, her voice cutting off as she realized the implications. But the doorman was too caught up in his tirade to notice the shift in the crowd's energy. He leaned closer to the woman, his voice low and biting. "Last chance. Leave, or I'll make this a lot worse for you." The homeless woman stood her ground, saying nothing, her silence speaking louder than any words could. The tension in the air was thick as the doorman's voice continued to ring out, his tone dripping with arrogance. The homeless woman stood silently, her composure unshaken despite the cold rain soaking through her coat. People passing by began to linger, their curiosity piqued by the scene. A few exchanged hushed whispers, while others simply stared, their expressions a mix of discomfort and anticipation. The doorman, now emboldened by what he perceived as the woman's refusal to comply, took another step forward. "You think you can just ignore me? Who do you think you are?" His voice was louder now, drawing more attention. Inside the hotel, staff members exchanged uneasy glances. The young bellhop, still watching from the side, fidgeted with the brim of his cap. "Should we step in?" he asked one of the older attendants, whose only response was a hesitant shrug. The murmurs among the crowd grew louder, and some onlookers even began recording the incident on their phones. One woman whispered to her friend, "Why is he going so hard on her? She's not even doing anything." Another guest, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, approached the doorman cautiously. "Hey," he said, placing a hand on his shoulder, "maybe you should tone it down. This doesn't look good." The doorman brushed him off with a dismissive wave. "I've got this under control," he said firmly, his eyes never leaving the woman. "She's loitering, and she's got no business being here." The homeless woman raised her head slightly, meeting his gaze. "You're making a mistake," she said softly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "A mistake," he repeated, laughing humorlessly. "The only mistake here is you thinking you belong anywhere near this place." In the growing crowd, a few people exchanged glances, some visibly uncomfortable with the way things were escalating. A young woman holding an umbrella frowned and whispered, "Why does she look so familiar? I swear I've seen her somewhere before." A man nearby nodded, his eyes narrowing as he tried to place her face. "Yeah. There's something about her." The doorman, oblivious to the shifting atmosphere, continued his tirade. "You've wasted enough of my time," he barked, pulling out his phone. "I'm calling security. Maybe they'll have better luck dealing with you." The woman didn't flinch. She stood there, calm and composed, as if waiting for the moment to speak. The rain fell harder, the sound of it blending with the muffled murmurs of the growing crowd. A man in a trench coat, standing near the back of the group, suddenly gasped. "Wait," he said loudly, his voice cutting through the noise. "Is that—" His words trailed off, but his expression was enough to catch the attention of those around him. The crowd began to shift uneasily, the buzz of speculation growing louder. Some people moved closer, craning their necks for a better look at the woman. The doorman, noticing the change in the crowd's demeanor, frowned. "What's going on?" he demanded, his confidence faltering slightly. Someone from the back called out, "I think that's Nicole Kidman's sister." The words hung in the air, and the tension shifted immediately. The doorman froze, his face a mix of confusion and disbelief. He turned back to the woman, his eyes scanning her face as if seeing her for the first time. The murmurs grew louder, and someone else chimed in, "It is her. I've seen pictures of her before." The homeless woman said nothing, her silence now carrying a weight that made the doorman take an involuntary step back. The crowd's energy transformed, from judgmental curiosity to shock and awe. People began pulling out their phones to take pictures, their whispers now filled with excitement and guilt for not having noticed sooner. The moment the realization spread through the crowd, the energy shifted entirely. The doorman, now visibly unsettled, stammered as he tried to piece together what was happening. "Wait. What? Nicole Kidman's sister?" His face paled as the weight of his actions began to sink in. The homeless woman still stood in silence, her expression calm yet piercing as she watched him squirm. The murmurs turned into audible gasps and chatter. People stepped closer, craning their necks to get a better look. Someone in the crowd said, "I can't believe he talked to her like that. This is going to be all over social media." The doorman's composure crumbled as the reality of the situation hit him. I didn't know," he stuttered, holding up his hands defensively. "I mean, she didn't say anything. How was I supposed to know who she was?" A woman in the crowd shook her head, her tone cutting. "It shouldn't matter who she is. You had no right to treat her that way." Her words hit like a slap, and others murmured in agreement. Suddenly, the grand entrance doors swung open, and Nicole Kidman herself stepped out, her presence commanding immediate attention. Dressed elegantly in a tailored coat, she radiated grace and poise, her sharp gaze cutting through the rain-soaked scene. The crowd fell silent, and even the murmurs stopped as everyone turned toward her. Nicole's eyes went straight to her sister. "There you are," she said softly, her voice warm and full of relief. She stepped forward and pulled the woman into an embrace, shielding her from the rain with her coat. The moment was intimate yet powerful, and the crowd watched in stunned silence. The doorman's mouth opened and closed, as if searching for words but finding none. He looked like a man whose entire world had just crumbled beneath him. "Ms. Kidman, I didn't know. I'm so sorry." His voice trailed off, his usual confidence replaced by sheer panic. Nicole turned to him slowly, her expression calm but unyielding. "Sorry," she repeated, her voice steady but cutting. "Is that what you say after humiliating someone just because they didn't fit your idea of who belongs here?" She stepped closer, her tone growing firmer. "You judged her without knowing anything about her. What does that say about you?" The doorman looked down, his shoulders slumping under the weight of her words. The silence from the crowd was deafening, their collective judgment heavier than anything he had faced before. His polished shoes shifted awkwardly against the wet pavement, but he had no response. Nicole's sister finally spoke, her voice gentle yet unwavering. "I didn't expect special treatment. I only wanted to wait here quietly." She glanced around at the crowd, her calm demeanor commanding their attention. How many people are treated like this every day, just because they don't look the part? A man in the crowd nodded, his expression somber. "She's right," he said quietly, his words carrying a weight that rippled through the gathering. Nicole turned back to the doorman, her expression softening slightly. "This isn't about me or my sister," she said. "It's about how we treat people when we think no one is watching. That says everything about who we are." The doorman swallowed hard, his face a mix of shame and regret. I didn't mean," he began, but Nicole held up a hand to stop him. "Think about your actions," she said firmly, "and the next time you meet someone who doesn't fit your expectations, maybe try kindness instead." The crowd watched as Nicole guided her sister into the hotel, the two women disappearing through the grand doors. The silence outside lingered for a moment longer before the murmurs resumed, this time tinged with reflection and guilt. The doorman stood frozen, his head hanging low as the weight of the moment settled on him. The bellhop, who had watched the entire scene unfold, stepped forward hesitantly and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Maybe this is a chance to do better," he said quietly before walking away, leaving the doorman alone in the rain. As the doors closed behind Nicole Kidman and her sister, the energy outside the hotel remained heavy. The crowd, now dispersing slowly, left behind a few lingering whispers and shaking heads. The doorman stood in the rain, his shoulders slumped, his once pristine uniform now damp and wrinkled. His confidence had evaporated, replaced by the unmistakable sting of shame. For the first time, he seemed aware of the judgmental stares from the few who lingered. His gaze dropped to the ground as if trying to avoid their silent rebuke. The young bellhop approached cautiously, holding an umbrella over both of them. "Are you all right?" he asked gently, though his tone carried a hint of something more, a quiet reminder that the man's behavior hadn't gone unnoticed. The doorman didn't answer at first, his hands trembling as he shoved his phone back into his pocket. "Finally," he muttered, "I didn't mean to. I didn't know." His voice trailed off, and he shook his head, frustrated with himself. "I thought she was just—" He stopped mid-sentence, realizing how wrong it sounded, no matter how he tried to justify it. The bellhop gave him a long look before responding. "You thought she was beneath you," he said softly but firmly. "You treated her like she didn't matter because of how she looked." The doorman opened his mouth to argue but stopped. There was no defense, no excuse. He nodded slowly, the weight of his actions pressing down harder now that they'd been laid bare so plainly. The bellhop's words echoed in his head, cutting through the rain that still fell around them. Inside the hotel, Nicole and her sister were seated in the lounge, their quiet conversation a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Nicole leaned forward, her hand resting gently on her sister's. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice full of concern. Her sister nodded. "I've dealt with worse," she said, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "But thank you for being there." Nicole shook her head. "You shouldn't have to deal with things like that. No one should." Her tone was firm now, tinged with frustration. "People need to learn to see beyond appearances." Her sister's expression softened. "Maybe today someone did. That man. He'll think twice before treating someone else that way." Outside, the doorman stood rooted in place as the bellhop quietly walked away, leaving him alone to face his thoughts. The words from Nicole, her sister, and the crowd swirled in his mind. He replayed the scene over and over, each moment more humiliating than the last. But beneath the shame, there was something else, a small, uncomfortable sense of clarity. A few moments later, he stepped inside, dripping rainwater onto the marble floors. The warmth of the lobby contrasted sharply with the chill that clung to him. He caught sight of the bellhop and hesitated before calling out, "Hey, wait!" The bellhop turned, his expression curious but cautious. The doorman took a deep breath, the words coming slowly. I'm sorry. For what I did. For how I acted." His voice wavered, but he pushed forward. "You were right. I judged her without knowing anything about her, and that's on me." The bellhop studied him for a moment before nodding. "It's not me you should be apologizing to," he said gently. The doorman looked away, his guilt heavier than ever. "I know," he said quietly. "I'll figure out how to make it right." Across the lounge, Nicole watched the interaction with quiet interest, her sister beside her. They exchanged a glance, neither saying a word, but the faint hint of a smile on her sister's face spoke volumes. Sometimes, even small moments of realization could ripple outward, planting seeds for change. By the time the rain stopped and the streets outside began to clear, the lesson lingered in the air, a quiet reminder of the importance of kindness and humility. The doorman, now sitting alone in the staff area, stared at his hands, wondering how he could make up for what he had done. The thought of that moment, the look in her eyes, the weight of her silence, stayed with him, urging him toward something better.